Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's probably appropriate that I apologise about the tie. So now, just while I'm unravelling my notes. Well, I was considering, sort of pondering really on what to speak about today, and after considering a few topics, I decided I'd probe into culture, British culture, but in particular something that's been of an interest to me for many years, and that's the area of theatre and the way that it's been smeared and discredited. And as a keen theatre goer, I've watched plays and musicals in London's West End at local theatre level and on Broadway. So earlier this year I was quite engrossed, and many of you may have seen this in the news. In fact, Mike and I were speaking about it earlier, that a theatre in Stratford in East London caused some excitement when they announced what they called a blackout performance, which was back in early July. Now, in essence, what this meant was that they asked white attendees to stay away from the event so the black audience would feel more comfortable without the presence of white people. Now, this obviously created a bit of a storm in the press, with some journalists rejoicing, of course, and some others who are a little bit more critical. Now, I'm personally not concerned if a black audience wished to congregate and observe probably what was a half-baked regional theatre performance. As far as I'm concerned, that's their prerogative. But what concerns me is the utter hypocrisy. If a regional or local theatre group wanted to develop a play and encouraged, let's call it a whiteout performance, where attendees of white heritage congregate at the theatre in the absence of black people, well, I'm pretty certain we know what the outcome would be. You know, the theatre would be closed, any charity funding would be withdrawn, and the committee in charge of the decision would be fired, and they may even face a visit from the local constabulary because of a potential breach of race relations laws. You know, and this genuinely happened in this country. Now, I used to love the theatre. You know, the anticipation of a live performance really enthused me. So I used to save my money, and 3 or 5 times a year or so I'd head into London's entertainment district and I'd watch a play or musical. But my enthusiasm for theatre has begun to really sour. And every time I attend theatre, I feel a little bit more disappointed. Instead, I feel that theatre, like most other tenets of British culture, is being taken away. In a way, it feels like it's being kidnapped because of this very dangerous creed that's permeating the core of our cultural institutions. Similar to cinema or television, I feel like I can no longer escape into a theatre and just slump into my seat and observe a live spectacle without a bombardment of what I'm going to call Marxist philosophical doctrine. And things, in my judgment, at the moment are going to get a lot worse. They'll get a lot worse because many of the cultural creeds that we see in Western societies originated in the arts. And it's the arts that are at the heart of the Marxist attack. Indeed, one playwright called Ryan Craig claims that wokeness is a form of ideological terrorism that undermines all of our societies. And this ideological terrorism is stifling creativity, and it's inducing self-censorship. In other words, we're reaching a point of creative extinction. You know, writers cannot pen their ideas freely through fear of offending the woke elite. Instead, they create or adapt to pander to Marxist dogma. I have a few examples for you that I've actually witnessed myself. A few years ago, I watched a show called School of Rock. You may have seen the film, or you may have heard of the film. The show is about a struggling rock guitarist who is fired from his band and subsequently poses as a substitute teacher at a prestigious school. Now, this should be a lively, fun performance free of any political reference and wokeism. But no, it isn't. The show features a schoolgirl, and she's too shy to speak. She's a mute, essentially. And we're introduced to this girl's parents. Now, although this girl is about 10, 11 years old, and she's black, we're introduced to her father, who is of East Asian heritage, and then we're introduced to her other father, who is a white man. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It's absolutely preposterous. There were hundreds of children sitting in this audience, and one can just hear them after the show asking Mummy and Daddy, why did that girl have 2 dads? And what's even more creepy, if you think about it, that the children in this cast, they too are being indoctrinated into this, what I'm going to call a poisonous creed. And then a few weeks ago, in fact, a friend and I attended the theatre of the Victoria Apollo, where Wicked is being played. 3 of the lead actors are black actors. And when we watched Moulin Rouge last year, the French painter Toulouse-Lautrec was also depicted by a black character, black man. Now, pushing for black actors to play white characters, particularly when these are white historical characterisations, is simply anti-white racism. And the problem is that it undermines all of theatre, including these actors themselves, because they may not be relevant for that particular role, but find themselves being ushered into a position they're not qualified for. So I think the most observed performance I've watched recently, though, was at the Phoenix Theatre in central London that was showing a musical called Come From Away. Now, many of you may not have heard from it, so I'm going to briefly outline the synopsis. And the show is based on the terror attacks in the United States in September 2001. It focuses on the town of Gander, which is in Newfoundland, Canada, in the week after the Islamist attacks. Nearly 40 planes carrying international passengers were redirected after the US closed its airspace in the aftermath of the assault. Now, the show features or follows the lives of the Gander residents and the air passengers as plane after plane lands in this small isolated town. Now, wherever our cultural and societal norms within this play could be denigrated, they really were. I've got some examples for you. There's two single individuals. One was a pompous Englishman, if you kind of think Hugh Grant. The other, a very assertive Texan woman, who were constantly lambasted because of their social credentials. And as their friendship blossomed, they were constantly belittled by a homosexual couple from Los Angeles who were environmentalists working in the industry. And I'm guessing they were working in the environmental industry just to save the world, I suppose. While, of course, the Texan woman works in the oil industry. And there was like this message there, really. The environmentalists pose a sort of deeper morality, I guess, than us oil-guzzling, car-driving, coal-burning, meat-eating climate deniers, you know. And this political dogma affected the entire flow of the performance. One character articulates the discrimination that she experienced in the 1980s when training to be an airline pilot. And the reason was that she was trying to become the first female pilot for, I don't know if it was a particular airline or the first female pilot in the United States. But the scene didn't contribute to the story, and nor did it fit the structure of the synopsis. It's a scene that has been injected into the show completely unnecessarily, simply because of virtue signalling and the message that it contains. Then the theme continues as a stranded passenger on one of the planes, who is of Middle Eastern Muslim heritage, sustains some animosity from his fellow airline passengers because of his appearance, and becomes isolated from fellow passengers and Gander residents alike. Meanwhile, the Gander residents and stranded passengers form friendships and connections, but they exclude this Muslim guy. In this circumstance, it's hardly surprising that anybody of similar racial and religious heritage to whom committed a terrorist atrocity might be considered with suspicion. But nonetheless, the theme is developed with a kind of sneering and contemptible posture towards the white passengers, consigning them all to small-minded, suspicious and dubious little racists, And of course it transpires, as you would probably expect, that the Muslim gentleman is very successful, is wealthy and is culturally Western. But luckily, of course, in the show he's a very forgiving man and embraces the concession of the passengers and the residents alike, who ooze with remorse and regret at their racist ways. And it struck me that this is incredibly ironic, that the only so-called prejudice identified within this show is directed to a Muslim gentleman, while any reference to the vicious Islamist violence of 9/11 is completely and utterly omitted. It's essentially what our opponents do, isn't it? That they rewrite and they adapt historical content to correspond with their own narrative. Nearly all of us are aware of the 9/11 attacks, but let's assume there's some people out there who are ignorant of what happened on that fateful day. Watching Come From Away, they would either be confused by the narrative, or worse, they'd be driven to a belief that the perpetrators of this depraved conduct were white Westerners. This brings me back really to where I started, namely that theatre has been subsumed in cultural revolutionist dogma. And sadly, of course, as we're all aware, our entire culture is under threat. It's not just theatre. It almost feels like a prized fighter who is a little bit over the hill, but not yet ready to accept his retirement. if we're not careful, we're going down. You know, the arts, engineering, science, biology, philosophy, mathematics, among other disciplines, are being denigrated, they're being defamed and slandered by the people in theatre and our cultures. But not just them, they're being slandered by the gangsters up the road in Westminster and their financial backers. It's no coincidence that both Marx and Engels were resolute in their understanding that culture underpins an epoch, and therefore if the culture of a civilization is dismantled, a Marxist creed can be easily ushered in. We're approaching the conclusion of Gramsci's long march through the institutions, but the sound of the communist jackboots marching in unison is still in the distance. More vociferous, yes, I'll grant you that, but we can still save our nation, we can still save our culture. I believe we still have time. It's a struggle, I accept it's a struggle, but for me, the next time I attend the theatre, I don't want Marxist dogma and woke culture thrust at me, corrupting our children's perspective of historical figures and relationships. And I don't want ideological terrorism annexing our theatre culture by embracing venomous creeds that poison our historical achievements and denigrate the creative culture that underpins our society. But we embrace struggle, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not suggesting that we enjoy it, but we embrace it because we know that nothing is worth having without a struggle. Think of the pompous politicians up the road in Westminster. Most of them are utter buffoons. You know, they've never worked, they've never struggled to feed their children, or had sleepless nights worrying about the next rent payment. Now, these people are aloof, they are not grounded. But we are. And that's why I joined the British Democrats, to protect our cultural heritage. All of it, by the way, not just our theatre, of course. And I know that we're engaged in a struggle. We're probably engaged in the greater struggle of our lives. But as we move forward in our struggle, we don't proceed with hatred or animosity. We move forward with cheerfulness and positivity. And why? Because we're trying to preserve something that's crucial. We're seeking a future, to secure a future for our children. We're trying to preserve our culture. We're trying to safeguard our institutions. We're trying to uphold biological realities. We're trying to defend our heritage. We're trying to protect our people, our Britain. And through this struggle and all this hardship, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to win.